Today's presentation is brought to you by the International Powered Access Federation, IPAF, and Allied Insurance Brokers. Our presentation today will be on risk assessments, control measures, and product selection for aerial work platforms. My name is Tony Grout. I'm the IPAF North American representative and Executive Vice President for AWPT, which is IPAF's training programs. I'm a committee member for the A92 Main Committee and the A92.3, .5, .6 subcommittees. I am a member of the ANSI U.S. Technical Advisory Group for Aerial Work Platforms, a council member for the SAIA Aerial Work Platform Council, and the IPAF International Manufacturers Technical Committee. I am a 31-year veteran of the rental industry. Work at height. All work at height exposes personnel to a fall hazard, regardless if the height is 12 inches or 120 feet. Falls from height is a leading hazard for workers, and particular attention must be taken to address known risk associated with all work at elevated heights. The tasks to be performed, the selection of the equipment to place workers at height, and avoiding hazards associated with the work must be addressed to keep workers safe and productive. This presentation will focus on a process known as risk assessment. Additionally, proper equipment selection and continuous monitoring and supervision for compliance are required elements of this scheme. You must select the proper equipment. There are some pictures of some creative devices that have been used when people are concentrating on getting the task done without taking proper time to select the equipment to safely perform the work. When working at height, choose an aerial work platform. Aerial work platforms are one of the safest means to access work at height. There's no climbing as you would have with ladders and scaffolding to get up and down from your work elevation. There's no disassembly or assembly required as you would have with scaffolding. The platform will put you at the exact height that you need. The platform is fully guardrailed and moves with you as you elevate and lower. It provides you with defined capacity so you know the exact weight that you can put into the platform safely. And it provides excellent reach. And numerous choices are available for your specific work needs from a wide range of choices of aerial work platforms and options available on them. And make the proper selection, you must consider site conditions. So access to the work area, will it fit, ground conditions, level rough terrain, adequate support, maximum tire pressure. Keep in mind that a 60-foot boom lift weighs approximately 23,000 pounds, and you can have up to 80% of the weight over one tire based on the configuration of that aerial work platform. So adequate support is a critical issue. Are you working interior or exterior? So the engine type, the combustion of the support for running the equipment is necessarily to consider, and the height and reach requirements. And then you must consider the task that you're performing. You need 110 volts at the platform, up and over reach. Know what the capacity for the personnel and materials needed to do the work, the mobility in the elevated position. You need two-wheel, four-wheel, oscillating axles, outriggers, or options on the equipment such as glazier and welding packages. You can see from these pictures there is a wide range of choices for the types of aerial work platforms and the reach and height that you can secure them, whether it's low or high, whether you need to get through narrow areaways or you need to have extensive reach and height and outreach. But before an aerial work platform arrives at the work site, whether it's new construction or an existing building, The employers must ensure a safe workplace. Section 5 of the OSHA Act, typically known as the 5A1, requires that every employer furnish each employee a location that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm or injury. This is the section of the OSHA Act that is used when OSHA has no written standard, but the employee is still subjected to a hazard. So when new products come out, new options are available and aren't covered in the OSHA standards because they were written before the equipment was in place, doesn't mean that OSHA doesn't cover them. If there's a recognized hazard, you have to address it. OSHA must document 4 elements any time that a citation is issued. First, that a hazard exists. Focus in on the word hazard because we're going to talk about that a lot throughout this presentation. That employees are exposed to the hazard. That the employer knew or should have known with the exercise of a reasonable diligence of the condition that exposed the employees to the hazard, and that a feasible means of abatement exists to protect the employees. Again, a hazard exists. So let's talk about some definitions so we're on the same page as we go through the presentation. First, what is a hazard? A hazard is the potential for harm. In practical terms, a hazard often is associated with a condition or activity that, if left uncontrolled, can result in an illness or injury. What is a reasonable diligence? It's a measure of prudence, responsibility, and diligence that is expected from and ordinarily exercised by a reasonable and prudent person under the circumstances. Think about any time that you've seen a situation that go by and say, boy, why didn't they do that? Why? They should have thought about this. Well, that's the type of mindset that goes into reasonable diligence. And what is a risk? It's the degree of probability that somebody could be harmed by a hazard. Therefore, to put oneself at risk means to participate in an activity or event that could lead to injury, damage, or loss. So how do we avoid a citation, or more appropriately, how do we ensure a safe workplace? The recommendation is to perform a risk assessment prior to every task or project. Hazard identification assessment means that the employer reviews the workplace safety and health information, inspects the workplace, identifies hazards, and prioritizes the hazards identified for elimination or control. You first must identify the hazard before you can avoid them. So here are some pictures of some job sites that we've seen that show hazards that should have been identified prior to work that, as you can see, can result in an accident and injury. So what is a risk assessment? Well, a risk assessment is a process to carefully examine what potential hazards exist in your workplace that may cause harm to employees. You evaluate the risk of each hazard exposing the employer or worker, and sets in place a control measure necessary to address the risk and prevent them. So how do we perform a risk assessment? Well, there are 5 basic steps. First is to identify the potential hazards. Then evaluate the risk of the hazards to the worker. Then you develop control measures to either eliminate or lower the risk. Then we document, communicate, and implement the plan. And we have to do review of the assessment and update as necessary. So step 1 is identify potential hazards. So how do I identify these hazards? Well, first basic step would be to walk around the workplace and thoroughly review work plans to identify what could reasonably harm the workers. Then we review your company injury reports, including near misses, and examine industry data. What has occurred in the past that should give us an idea of what we should reasonably expect may occur in the future. Discuss the work with your frontline employees, the people who are out there doing it. They're going to have ideas that you may not have about what some of the problems that they're exposed to are. Review manufacturers' instructions and manuals. They have a wide range of exposure that they share with those people using their products. Visit OSHA's website, www.osha.gov, for some practical guidance on the topics. Contact your insurance carrier or a trade association, awpt.org, who may provide helpful guidance. And examine new tasks or tasks that are potentially hazardous and discuss them with your workers. The U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, provide a census of fatal occupational injuries, known AWP fatalities. The first one is electrocution. Then we have falls, ejections, stability, tip-overs, crushing, which is caught between, and struck by or against. These potential hazards must be considered when performing a risk assessment. Industry-recognized potential hazards can also be found by reviewing the ANSI standards. The ANSI A92.5 standards under Section 710 provides operator warning and instructions. The user shall warn personnel of potential hazards, provide the means to protect against identified hazards, and explain potential consequences of not following proper operating guidelines. So in the standard itself, they are telling you that you must identify hazards, explain them, and take action steps. So instructions and guidelines shall include, but aren't necessarily limited to, the following issues. So within the standards, they provide a list of 37 different topics that must be included in an employer's review to provide guidance and instructions to the workers. And this list gives you a wide range of items, some of which may apply to a particular task and some may not. And as your tasks change, they may come into place. So items such as fall protection, slopes and grades, deployment of stability-enhancing means, outriggers and stabilizers, guardrail systems, the distribution of the load in the platform, maintaining overhead clearance, electrocution hazards, personal protective equipment, personal footings, meaning making sure that you have a level surface and you're not putting debris that would cause a tripping hazard and other problems, or trying to elevate yourself above the platform that would mitigate the protection that the guardrails are providing you. Precautions for other moving equipment or vehicles, reporting problems or malfunctions, and reporting potentially hazardous locations. And the list goes on with the remainder of those 37 items that you can look at and you should be aware of if you're using an airwork platform that are part of the ANSI standards. You also need to consider hazards to others. So when evaluating hazards, remember to include people in addition to your workers, such as others who share the workplace with you. People who you may not consider part of it, such as cleaners or maintenance personnel, who may not be at the work site full time, visitors to the workplace, and members of the public. They may introduce new hazards, such as being hit from dropped items. So if you're working overhead and you're not thinking about it, but you have other people coming in place and you drop something, you now have introduced another potential hazard. Crushing hazards from moving the aerial work platform or lowering the platform on top of other people. And in addition to that, they may also increase the potential hazard to your workers that need to be addressed. So if they're there doing work and driving other vehicles, you could have crushing, you could have the machines hit one another and cause instability issues. So all of those issues must be taken into account. So once we have identified the hazards, we now have to evaluate the risk of the hazards. So the risk, again, is the degree of probability that somebody could be harmed by a hazard. Therefore, to put oneself at risk means to participate in an activity or event that could lead to injury, damage, or loss. One of the potential hazards are once they're identified, you must decide what to do about them, the level of risk, whether it's low, medium, or high. That will guide your decision on the control measures that are required to mitigate the risk. So I'm going to provide an example here. So we have a work location with overhead electrical wires as a potential hazard. So if your work is not located within the safe working distance allowed for proximity to electrical conductors, you don't need to take additional control measures as the risk is low. However, if the work gets closer or may get closer to those overhead wires, or the mobility on site means that you're going to have to drive by them to get to your work area so you have an exposure, the risk may become medium to high, and then appropriate control measures must be developed. When we develop them, we then need to put in control measures. So once potential measures are identified, the control measures must be established to either eliminate or limit the risk of the hazard to cause harm. They are assessed as follows. In a hierarchy of control measures, we end up having 6 different items, and I'm going to start with the most preferred to the least preferred. Most preferred is eliminate the hazard entirely. Second is substitute. Third is isolate. Fourth is developing engineering controls. Fifth is putting in administrative controls. And last is putting in place personal protective equipment. So looking at control measures, I'm going to provide an example just to reference these options. So one is, the example is changing overhead warehouse ceiling lights. First one is eliminate the hazard. Well, if we're going to do this, how would we eliminate that hazard? Well, let's remove all the ceiling lights. Let's replace the lights that lower to the ground level so they can be changed at the ground level rather than elevating and putting ourselves at risk. Well, that may not be practical. So if this is not practical, excuse me, we go to a substitution. So substitute the hazard with a lesser risk. So let's replace with bulbs with long-lasting bulbs that require less frequent changing. Well, if that's not practical, let's isolate it. So let's tag, when the lights go out, let's just tag them out of service. Well, ultimately, you're probably going to want the lights, and that may not be practical. So then we use engineering controls. So we select an aerial work platform for access to work at height, selecting a unit that has full guardrail system and can adequately place the workers in the location to reach the lights. Well, if that's not practical, we're going to use administrative controls. Well, administrative controls ensure that the supervisors and aerial work platform operators are properly trained and qualified to perform the task. And if this is not practical, use personal protective equipment. So we use some type of fall protection equipment. So in sequencing, some and even all of these may be applicable to the control measures you need to put in place. Here's a sample risk assessment. So we have a hazard, we have the risk, we have the potential for the risk, and the control measure. So the first one is a rough terrain or poor conditions. And the risk is that the aerial work platform may exceed the manufacturer's grade ability, become unstable, and tip over or eject the occupant. Potential risk is high. So how are we going to control that? Well, we control that by only selecting an aerial work platform that is designed to operate on rough terrain surfaces and use in compliance with the manufacturer's recommendations. Another example is weather conditions may produce high winds. But the risk is that the wind gust may exceed allowable design wind loads, making the aerial work platform unstable and potentially tip over. The potential for that is low. You're not going to find winds, high winds on an ongoing basis over there, so you have the low risk. So how do we control that? Well, we make sure that we have accurate monitoring of the wind on site and cease use when the wind load is expected to approach the maximum allowable wind speed. Another example is for a hazard, overhead wires are in the work area. The risk is personnel may come in contact with an arc or conductors resulting in electrocution or burns. The risk is medium. And how do we control it? We barricade the AWP from exceeding the minimum approach distance. We make sure that it can't get close to that hazard. So once we go through our risk assessment, obviously we want to document it and implement it. This is an important step that is proof that the process was done. It also provides you with important information that may be used in future risk assessments because there's no sense in recreating this each time that you have a task. Obviously, it's important that you communicate the plan with your workforce so that they can implement all of these procedures. And we need to supervise and monitor for compliance to assure that the plan is working, that your team understands the control methods, and the results are acceptable. This document can be revised and used continuously as you work with aerialists in the future. And our last step, step 5, is the review and update. Well, keep in mind that very few workplaces or tasks stay the same. Sooner or later, you're going to bring in new equipment, going to have changes in the work environment, the procedures may be altered and create or bring about new potential hazards. It makes sense, therefore, to review what you're doing on an ongoing basis. It is recommended that each year a formal review is completed to make sure your control measures are still appropriate and adequate for the work being performed. Examine your risk again. Have there been any changes? Are there improvements that you still can make? Have your workers identified new potential hazards that you weren't aware of that you need to now address? Have you discovered anything new from accidents or near misses? Make sure your risk assessment stays up to date. Take the steps to prevent these types of things from occurring at your workplace. Here are pictures that unfortunately can be taken too frequently where you can see people who are exposed to hazards that a proper risk assessment, properly implemented and monitored, would prevent. IPAF is currently working with the American Rental Association, the Scaffold and Access Industry Association, the Associated Equipment Manufacturers to create an industry-approved guidance for aerial work platform risk assessments and proper aerial work platform selection. This guidance is targeted to be released in February of 2013. This document will be available on our website when it's complete under the publication tab. So mark your calendars and visit www.awpt.org and get your copy in February when it is completed and released. Available for free downloads. So I thank you for your attention. This completes our presentation. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact Jeff McGrary or myself, Tony Groats, at the contact information below. We thank you for your attention and look forward to speaking to you in the future.